Okay, so now that we have our front end loading the data from the back end via WebSockets, we're going to see how we can have our front end listen for changes to that data. Because currently, if we have another user who shares a new note with this one, and to do that, I'm going to open up an incognito window. And here, we'll just put them side by side. There we go. So let's go to localhost 3000 notes in this one and log in as another user. We're going to log in as the test2 user. And there we go, and put in the password now, and click login. And what's going to happen is if we click on one of these notes and try and share it with this other user, right? Let's say that we try and share my secret note with this other user. We're going to enter in their email, which I'm just going to copy and paste from up here. And we'll click share. And this other user isn't actually going to see that until they refresh their page, right? If they refresh their page, they'll see my secret note show up. And likewise, if we unshare this note, right, this user isn't going to see that either until they refresh their page. So what we're going to want to do is have our front end listening for changes to that data and have our back end be the one that's actually sending those events in the first place. So in order to make this work, what we're going to have to do is go over to our code and find the corresponding endpoint for sharing notes, right? That's going to be the share note route and the unshare note route. And essentially what we're going to do inside these two routes is emit an event whenever the note is actually updated, right? So once we have our updated note, we'll want to say sockets.emit, blah, blah, blah. Same thing for our share note route. We'll want to emit an event that's called shared note or something like that. Now, before we'll actually be able to do this from inside our share note route and unshare note route, we're going to need to figure out a way that our share note route and unshare note route can get access to the I/O. Because currently all of our I/O logic is defined inside our server.js file, which is importing both of these routes here. So because of that, we can't have these routes import I/O directly from our server file, right? That would create a circular dependency. So what we're going to need to do here is going to be very similar to what we did with our DB file, right? Where we created this client and then had this initialize DB connection function that we called from inside our server. We're going to do something very similar with I/O. We're going to create a new file here, which we'll call io.js. And inside here, we're going to say export let io equals null, all right? Again, just like we did with DB. And once we've done that, we're going to say export const initialize io equals server. And what this is going to do is simply set io equal to the socket io, which we're going to have to import by saying import socket io from socket io. And then we're going to say socket io server. And we're going to have to include that cores thing with origin star and methods star. All right. So that will basically take care of initializing I/O, and we'll now be able to import this I/O thing into all of our routes. So here's what that's going to look like. We're going to go into our server first of all and call this initialize I/O function by going into here. And then up here at the top, actually, let's do it right under where we import the DB stuff. We're going to say import initialize IO. And we're also going to import IO itself from the IO file. All right, so now all we need to do is replace this const IO thing with initialize IO. So we're going to just call that function like that. Oops, there we go. And that should really be all we need to do. Oh, we also need to pass the server to it so that it can create the wrapper around the server. And that should be all we need to do in our server.js file. So now that we've done that, we can access IO from inside our share note route and unshare note route by saying import IO from IO. Actually, that's going to be //IO. There we go. And then what we're going to do, like I said, is once we have the updated note, we're going to emit an event that our front end can listen for, telling the front end what happened. So what that's going to look like is we're going to want to find out what user this updated note was just shared with find the socket that they're connected to, if any, and send a request to only that socket, right? That'll make sure that only that user sees that event, which obviously is the only person we want to see that event. So what that's going to look like, just bear with me here because it does take a little bit of logic to figure out whose socket is whose. So we're going to say io.sockets.sockets. Remember that weird double sockets thing that we need to do. And what we're going to do is say for each socket in IO, basically we're going to check to see if the socket's user ID is equal to the ID of this user with email that we calculated when another user entered in that user's email to share the note with. All right, so what that's going to look like, we're going to say sockets.forEach socket. And actually, let's change this to target socket just to make it more obvious what we're doing here. And inside this function, what we're going to do is say if the target socket's user ID matches user with email's ID. So what that looks like, if target socket.user.uid is equal to user with email.id, then and only then, what we're going to want to do is emit an event with this updated note to that socket. So that would look like this. We'd say target socket.emit, and we would emit an event which we'll call something like note shared. And the data that we're going to pass along with this event is going to be the updated note formatted. So we're going to need to say target socket.user and format shared note, which we're going to have to import here, format shared note. And we're going to pass the updated note to this along with the user from the target socket. Okay, again, this format shared note will make sure that that user has the correct role set for them on that note now. And that's pretty much all we need to do inside our share note route. Oh, one last thing. Let me import this format shared note thing here. We just need to go up to the top, say import format shared note. And that's going to be from util/format shared note. Oh, and one last thing we need to do is in this if statement, we need to add a question mark to user just in case there is no user on the target socket, right? And that, by the way, is a handy shorthand for doing target socket.user and target socket.user.uid, right? So here we go. Let's just delete all of that. Oops, there we go. Okay, so that should take care of only emitting that event for the corresponding user that that note was just shared with. So what we're going to need to do now is go back to our front end and listen for this note shared event. So let's open up notes provider, and right underneath initial notes, we're going to say socket.on shared, or we called it note shared rather, note shared. And this is going to contain the updated note. And what we're going to do is just add this note onto the end of our existing notes, right? Our existing shared notes, that is. So we should actually probably call this something other than updated note. What we'll do is say new shared note. And then inside here, we're going to say set shared notes and set those to the current shared notes. Whoops, not all caps. There we go. Current shared notes dot concat new shared note. All right, so that should be all of the pieces we need to bring together here. Let's test this thing out and see if it's working. So what we're going to do is go back to our application. We're going to refresh both of these pages. All right, there we go. And we're going to try and share this My Secret Note with this other user here. So let's just copy that user's email and paste it. And we're going to click on share, and what we should see is that that note will appear immediately under shared with me. So let's see if we did everything correctly and click share. And oops, it looks like something isn't quite right there. We do see My Secret Note, but that got rid of the other notes that were shared with the user. And if we refresh this, by the way, we'll see all three notes. So this is just a basic logic problem on our side. So what's happening here is we're unwittingly creating what's called a closure in socket.on. Now, explaining that is way beyond the scope of what we're trying to do here, but just know that when this callback function is being defined, shared notes doesn't exist yet. So what we're going to need to do instead is move this socket.on stuff out of this use effect hook. And we're going to add a new use effect hook, which will say use effect. And we're going to paste all of that stuff in there. Now, what we're going to need to do in order to make this work is add socket as a state variable to our notes provider, just like we did in our note detail page. So let's create a new variable, which we'll call socket and set socket. And then we're going to say equals use state, and the initial value of this is going to be null. All right, so now what we're going to do is once we've created a new socket connection, we're going to say set socket to socket. And then down here in this new use effect hook, we're going to listen for changes to that socket. And we're going to say if the socket exists, then we're going to define these things. All right, and we're also going to need to listen for new things such as changes to shared notes here, all right, so that this stuff will be updated when shared notes is updated. So we're going to need to add shared notes here, and that should be pretty much all we need for the time being. So let's give this thing another try. We're going to go back to our application. We're going to refresh everything. We're actually going to remove this user's email from the shared users for my secret note. And if we refresh this, we'll see that that note disappears. So let's try sharing this note again. We're going to copy this email address. We're going to paste it into here and click share. And sure enough, we see that my secret note shows up exactly as we want it to. Awesome. So we got note sharing to work, which is exactly what we were going for. So the last thing that we're going to take a look at here is how to do the opposite thing and unshare notes automatically from a user's list. So to see how that works, what we're going to do is go back to our unshare note route, and we're going to do pretty much the same thing that we did in our share note route, right? In fact, it's going to be so similar that we can really just copy this io.sockets.sockets blah, blah, blah stuff, and we're going to paste that. Oops, we're going to paste that inside unshare note route. And we're also going to have to import io as well as format shared notes. So I'll just get those from up here, copy that, paste that here, and same thing for format shared note. We'll copy that and paste it. There we go. And now what we're going to do is instead of emitting a note shared event, we're going to emit a note unshared event. Okay, now what we're going to do here is we're not actually going to send back the updated note, so we actually don't need the format shared note thing up here. We are going to send back the updated note's ID. So what that'll look like, we're just going to say updated note.id, and the front end is going to be responsible for taking that ID and using that to remove it from the list. All right, now another slightly tricky part of this is that we're not actually loading the user, right? We don't have user with email here like we did before. So we're actually going to have to load that user just so we can get their ID. And what that's going to look like is we're just going to say const user with email equals await users db, which we're going to have to import, dot find one, and we're going to find a user with that email, right? The email that we got from the request parameters up here. And that should complete what we needed to do down here. Awesome. So let's go back to our front end now in our notes provider and add another event handler for this note unshared event. So what that's going to look like, we're going to add socket.on, and we're going to say note unshared. And then inside here, we're going to have the ID of the note that was unshared. And what we're going to do is something that we've done many, many times before. We're going to say set shared notes, and we're going to filter the shared notes by ID by saying shared notes.filter. And then for each note, we're just going to make sure that that note's ID does not equal the ID of the note that was just unshared. And that should be all we need to do there. So let's go back to our browser and check to see if this works. We're going to refresh both of these to make sure that everything's up to date. And let's try unsharing this note with this user here. What we should see is that this will disappear immediately from the user's list. So let's click on that. And sure enough, we see that that note disappears immediately. So what we've done here again is we've created a persistent connection that the front end has with the server that will make sure that the data on the front end stays in sync with the data on the server. right? So, in other words, it helps us to avoid situations where a user is seeing that a note was shared with them and they click on it and then they see a page that says, hey, this note isn't shared with you. How'd you get here? Right? It's generally a good thing to be able to avoid those, which is what we've done here. Now, obviously, you might want to add a little bit more user interface polish to this. You might want to, instead of having the note completely disappear, have it just fade out or something, or have a message be displayed in place of it, something like that. And those would just involve basic front end logic, right? They wouldn't require anything full stack. So I'm going to leave those as an exercise for you. But anyway, what we've done here is we've come a very long way in fully integrating WebSockets into our application. And we're using them really as a way to maximize the user experience and make sure that all users are seeing data that's as up to date as possible. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.